So Dina Al-Kassim, she writes on contemporary political subjectification and aesthetics in literature of the MENA and the West. She's the author of On Pain of Speech, Fantasies of the First Order and The Literary Rant. She was also a professor of comparative literature and TI at Irvine, and she now teaches English and the Institute of Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. And she's holding a residency and postdoctoral fellowships from Stanford, Harvard, and the UCHRI.
Can you hear me? Is it okay? No? How about now? Yes. Now? Yeah, good. Okay. I've never given a paper with a knight on the panel, so I'm very happy to have this opportunity. So I'm going to read fast, I think, so that we all have time to give our papers. What you see behind me is a part of the English translation of Mahmoud Darwish's poem, The Red Indian's Penultimate Speech to the White Man, and it's Fadi Juda's translation. And I'm showing it to you so that you can see the North American indigenous themes, and in particular, to see this phrase, do not wound the turtle whose back the earth, our grandmother, the earth, sleeps upon. Our trees are her hair, and our adornment her flower. And the reasons for this will become, I hope, clear. This paper is part of a work on poetic solidarity as a formal and philosophical problem in aesthetics and a critical challenge to normative understandings of committed or activist solidarity in writing. When works by North American and Palestinian indigenous authors and select anti-colonial writers are read together, al-Kalima is trying to get me on the email, through actual chains of contact, influence, and shared situations, a complex practice of solidarity becomes legible, one that is already in the late 1970s thinking ecologically and warning of the normalization of occupations effected through permanent impermanence, proliferation of legal limbos, and control through resource scarcity and new waves of land theft in Canada and Palestine alike. The story I tell today exemplifies these trends by locating poetic solidarity in an actual meeting between poets in Turtle Island, the indigenous name for the North American continent drawn from several different creation stories. This example carries a signature form of poetic solidarity expressed through the multiplication of material references to land, warnings of ecological destruction of worlds, and the undermining of certainty. Here, sociology and geography are folded into and molded by poets to become more than ideology. Put bluntly, this form of solidarity communicates where impossibility, intolerable paradox, and contradiction are most felt. Mahmoud Darwish expressed this plainly in the poem The Red Indian's Penultimate Speech to the White Man when he wrote, and I quote him in English, "We know that fact is more important than truth," with a capital T in the English translation, obviously not in the Arabic. In 1976, Mahmoud Darwish visited Turtle Island and represented the Palestinian delegation to the UN Habitat Vancouver, BC conference, the precursor to the establishment of the UN Commission on Human Settlement and Sustainability. In Vancouver, Darwish met Métis Stolo poet. Those are two different groups of indigenous people, Lee Miracle, and through this encounter forged indigenous Palestinian and Métis Stolo alliance, at least in poetry. During that visit, Miracle read Darwish in English while he recited himself in Arabic. Today I will say only a few words about Lee Miracle, who recently passed away and is commemorated by an obituary from the Canada-Palestine Association. Oh, she's commemorated. Hello? I want to thank Hannah Kawas for sharing historical documents from the 1976 meeting with me and for making some of these public through his work on the CPA website. The UN documents which emerged directly and indirectly from this work on water, land, and sustainability bear witness to a world before neoliberal neoliberalism translated human rights into aspects of human security, and I'm thinking of the 1994 UNDP. What is the significance of the 1976 UN Habitat Conference? Not only did it lay the groundwork for the establishment of the UN Commission on Human Settlements and Sustainability, it mandated improved sustainable access to safe water and basic sanitation. And yet today, in indigenous reserves throughout Canada, as in Gaza, safe drinking water is in short supply or non-existent. While serving as a founding member of the PNC, Darwish revisited a moment of Turtle Island's history in the red man's penultimate speech to the white man, which uncannily speaks of conditions here in Palestine through explicitly indexing the location, the plants even, and history of the Duwamish people, the indigenous people he was talking about. He imagined the voice of Chief Seattle, whom he cites in an epigraph. These are the famous words of Chief Seattle. Penultimate speech is perhaps most famous as the Darwish poem recited and enacted by George Aquilar in Jean-Luc Godard's Notre Musique, in which Darwish appears playing himself. Chief Seattle's oration of 1854 is held to be a prescient, early ecological manifesto, as well as a carefully encoded speech of anti-colonial resistance hidden in the language of defeat. And this is how, what's going on? This is how the Squamish community presents the oration on their community website. Darwish does not appropriate the story of other cultures here, but instead weaves together elements of the chief's speech with material realities of colonial violence, several histories of conquest, and the contours of the Duwamish River. This is to say that the poet explicitly ties the chief's speech to the land and does so out of an intimate knowledge of that relation, thus echoing one indigenous voice with his own indigenous voice in a masterful defense of land as repository of memory. Care for ecology marks all Darwish's writing, in my opinion, but comes into greater historical focus in the poem cycle in English 11 Planets as it builds on the theme of land and water, begun narratively in Memory for Forgetfulness, August, Beirut, 1982, his prose memoir of the Siege of Beirut, which carries a lengthy citation from Ibn Sida's lexicography to gather 112 words for water transcribed in the early 11th century. And this is his selection of these words. In these works, numbers and lists of plants, animals, aspects of terrain and landscape accrue mounting significance in the years after the loss of Beirut. Maricol is often quoted saying, "No one owns the water. Water belongs to itself." As the author of one of the first indigenous works published in Canada, the memoir Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel, she is a highly decorated national author. Her widely read story, Goodbye Snouk, recounts the land and water dispossession of the Musqueam people who lived on the sand flats and feasted on the sea creatures and vegetables that thrived in the tidal marshland which was drained to create Vancouver's tourist attraction, the False Creek. Equally important, Maricol was a socialist activist in the 1970s who, as a member of the Native Study Group, became a pivotal figure in Canadian Palestinian solidarity, as attested by the CPA's archives and by the fact that her poem, Remembering Mahmoud, is frequently read at Palestinian solidarity rallies in British Columbia, where Palestinian letters and declarations of solidarity with indigenous sovereignty are part of the record of 20th and 21st century protest in BC. And this is the website, and this is a portion of the poem. Here is the poster from 1976 of some of their events. this, in fact, of the meeting, I believe. Despite a smear campaign mounted by the local and national press, the Native Study Group welcomed the PLO delegation by issuing an incendiary statement that I cannot show you, authored by Miracle, and in January 1976 held a public celebration of the 11th anniversary of the Palestinian Revolution. 5 months later, Miracle introduced Darwish at the event where the two poets read. According to Miracle and Kawas, Darwish expressly requested that an indigenous poet should be his voice in English at all planned public events. A few months after the 1976 meeting, the UN General Assembly passed resolutions 32-162, establishing the Commission on Human Settlements, and on the same day, and in the same chamber, 32-161, Resolution 161 exhibits a similar concern for water and declares the permanent sovereignty of the Arab states and peoples over natural resources against, and I'm quoting them, the aggression of the occupying power. The resolution does not name the occupied people. Rather, it recalls its previous resolutions on permanent sovereignty over natural resources, particularly, quote, their provisions supporting resolutely the efforts of the developing countries and the peoples of the territories under colonial and racial domination and foreign occupation in their struggle to regain effective control over their natural and all other resources, wealth, and economic activities. The text of the resolution describes the illegality of the occupier, stating, quote, occupiers' repeated, quote, Israeli aggression and continued occupation of their territories, and urges UN member states to resist their attempts, quote, to effect any changes in demographic composition or geographic character or institutional structure of those territories. The establishment of the UN habitat reflects the consciousness that these problems require international cooperation and charges UN member nations to find solutions, quote, based on equity, justice, solidarity, especially among the developing countries. But it is Miracle's and Darwish's readings in 1976 that consolidated a parallel solidarity between colonized subjects pursuing their duty to and kinship with the land, the people, and the water through ecological engagements that we now call sustainability in acknowledgement of the unsustainable. Affinities with native land loss and moments of Nakba throughout Darwish's poetry of this period provide the historical coordinates of shared but not identical experience, which in turn builds up a genealogy of survivance, which is to say, successive sequence of skills. In the link between Palestinian and native North America, attested by the circuit of poems between Miracle, Darwish, Russell Means, and others from the late 70s, land and rights are unassailably linked through forms of responsibility that are deformative for capitalism. Oops. This is my friend Steven Saleta's book that explains some of these connections, but doesn't do very much literary analysis. Despite playing a key role drafting the Palestinian Charter and other founding documents that attempted to recenter Palestine from revolution to the territorial technocracy, Darwish quit the PNC in 1996 as a result of the Oslo Accord, which brought misery by other means, one of which has been the militarized appropriation of water to match theft of land and cultural erasure. By dint of the Oslo Accord, Israel owns and controls the water and its circulation here, in Gaza and Golan and beyond. Beyond is a nebulous territory, as Israel's actions have led directly to the depletion of aquifers and their pollution by improper or in some cases non-existent water treatment. When the level falls, dirty water enters the aquifer. Sovereignty over water in the region bears the responsibility for the health of the living, the land, and also time. In the very concrete sense of planning for the future replenishment of ancient aquifer, the present is the future is dreamed on the model of the past, yet there is no time but static crisis. According to sources as varied as the IMF and UNESCO, Israel practices, quote unquote, a policy of expulsion through engineered water scarcity, end quote, while cornering the world market in innovating desalination processes through nanotechnology in research partnerships with UCLA, USC, the campus where I teach, UBC, and other, quote unquote, cultural institutions in North America. For Palestinians in the OPT, the choices come down to one. I'm actually talking about Gaza, I think. Buying water from the occupier as UN plans for new desalination plants are always already halted. Because 80 to 85% of groundwater in the OPT is used by Israel, while only 10% have access to potable water, today in Gaza, a centered, place-based knowledge, these are all the good attributes of sustainability discourse in the West. So a centered, place-based knowledge practiced by Palestinians includes the knowledge that one must decide how to divide desalinated and boiled water into its different waters. One for bathing, one for cooking, another for plants and animals, yet another for flushing and drinking only plastic bottled water sold to them by the colonial settler state. The situation for Indigenous communities in Canada is a bit better, but includes the absence of drinking water in Native communities. In 2016, Human Rights Watch citing 134 water advisories in 90 First Nations reservations, 90. 85 of them in the province where the capital is, Ontario. This report concluded that the Canadian government has failed in its duty to provide safe water for First Nations communities. This negligence is fed by the regulatory and funding problems that derive from the continued existence of the 1877 Indian Act, which grants jurisdiction over reserves to the federal government without requiring it to adequately fund communities or provide infrastructure. As a result, First Nations have faced decades of damage due to water scarcity in a country of immense water waste. To end, I want to emphasize that the small gestures connecting ecology to the catalog of colonial ruin, which I've sketched here, for instance, asking that an Indigenous voice read or keep alive the memory of a Palestinian poet in local protests far, far away, constitutes forms of responsibility, theorized decades later by Gayatri Spivak as planetary thinking, found in pre-capitalist cultural sources, but crucially in indigeneity. And I quote her, "The more ecological practice of living, where the opposition between the human and the natural is made indeterminate, is of course the Aboriginal." And I'd like to end there. Thank you.